The reinforced double doors of the private suite didn't just open. They buckled under the weight of Bae Duyun's arrival. Behind him, the panicked murmurs of his syndicate captains were cut short as the doors clicked shut, sealing the room in a heavy, airless silence. Janie Lockman sat upright against the pillows, her warm brown skin still glowing with the exertion of the labor that had brought their sons into the world. She held the twins, two perfect, light brown miracles, pressed against her heart. As Duyun approached, Janie reached out, her fingers trembling toward the pristine, matte olive sleeve of his suit. "Don't touch me." The words weren't a request. They were a sentence. Duyun didn't flinch. His almond-shaped eyes, deep-set and unreadable, remained fixed on a point just above her head, refusing to acknowledge the infants. He stepped back, the sudden void between them expanding like a physical bruise. With a clinical precision, he straightened his tie, his expression as restrained and emotionally detached as a statue carved from ice. On the sleek security monitor mounted to the wall, a black sedan with opaque windows pulled into the hospital's restricted loading zone. "The papers are already filed," Duyun said, his voice a flat, dead horizontal line. "They are not my blood. You, and the children, are no longer a part of this lineage." The lie hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. "A car is waiting," he continued, eyes cold and focused. "You go to the secondary estate. You stay out of the light until I have scrubbed this failure from the records." He turned his back, his long, dark shadow stretching across the cribs, eclipsing the warmth Janie had fought so hard to protect. He walked out before her first tear could fall, leaving behind a silence that felt like a death knell. This rejection wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a dinner bell for the wolves. By publicly discarding the woman who had just saved his empire and disowning his heirs, Duyun had signaled a fatal fracture in his ironclad rule. To the board of elders and the rival factions lingering in the hallways, there was now a vacuum of power. If the boss wouldn't claim his own blood, his enemies would, and they would start by hunting the ghosts he had just cast out into the cold. Janie lay back against the bed, her body still vibrating from the battle of birth and the shock of the betrayal. Her natural curls, which Duyun had once touched with possessive reverence, now clung damply to her temples as she realized the man she saved had just made her the most hunted woman in Seoul. The silver Mercedes Maybach idling in the hospital's restricted bay was more than a luxury vehicle. It was a motorized sarcophagus, designed to carry Janie and her sons into the silent oblivion of the secondary estate. Through the tinted glass of the hospital's exit, she could see the driver, a man named Kim, whose loyalty belonged strictly to the payroll of the Bay syndicate, standing as rigid as a tombstone. He didn't look at her as she approached. He looked through her, as if she were already a ghost. Janie felt the weight of the twin carriers in her hands, a physical anchor against the dizzying vertigo of Duyun's betrayal. Her body still hummed with the phantom echoes of labor, a deep, rhythmic ache that reminded her she had just performed a miracle for a man who had repaid her with a public execution. Her natural curls were pulled back, her chin held at that precise, lethal angle that had once commanded the respect of the Empire's logistics captains. As they reached the curb, Kim stepped forward to open the heavy rear door. The scent of expensive leather and ionized air wafted out, a sterile invitation to disappear. "The master has given strict instructions, madam," Kim said, his voice as devoid of warmth as the winter air. "You are to be settled at the Gyeonggi Villa by nightfall. For your safety." Janie stopped 3 feet from the open door. She looked at the car, then at the man, and finally at the darkened windows of the hospital wing, where Duyun was likely already meeting with the board of elders, washing his hands of her. "My safety," Janie repeated, the words tasting like copper. "Or his convenience?" "Madam, please. The elders are watching." "Let them watch," Janie said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant register that made Kim's eyes flicker with the first sign of unease. "But they won't be watching me rot in a gilded cage in the countryside." She didn't step toward the Mercedes. Instead, she turned her back on the syndicate's motorcade, and began walking toward the public taxi stand at the far end of the terminal. The movement felt like tearing a suture, a sharp, necessary pain. "Madam," Kim's footsteps hurried behind her. "You cannot." "The protocols, the master's orders." Janie stopped and turned. The single tear that had fallen in the suite was gone, replaced by a gaze as glossy and impenetrable as obsidian. Bae Doon told the world these children are not his blood. If that is the truth he wants to live by, then he no longer has the authority to dictate where they sleep. "Tell your master that the ghosts he cast out have moved on." She didn't wait for a response. She signaled a black premium taxi, the kind used by businessmen and tourists who didn't want to be found. As the driver helped her secure the infants, Janie reached into her silk wrap and pulled out a sleek, titanium-encased black card. It wasn't tied to the Bae family accounts. It was an account she had built herself, funded by the consulting fees she had quietly siphoned during the months she spent fixing Diyun's fractured supply lines. It was her own leverage, her own silent rebellion. "The Park Hyatt Seoul," she told the driver. "Take the long route. Avoid the main arteries." As the taxi pulled away, Janie looked back. The silver Mercedes remained stationary in the bay, a symbol of a life she was no longer willing to live on someone else's terms. She looked down at the twins, their rounded cheeks pressed against the soft knit caps. They were peaceful, unaware that their mother had just declared a private war against the most powerful man in the country. The city of Seoul blurred past in a neon smear of rain and light. Janie felt the exhaustion finally threatening to pull her under, but she forced her eyes to stay open, watching the reflection of the cars behind them in the wing mirror. She wasn't just a wife anymore. She wasn't a liability to be managed. By the time the taxi pulled into the sleek, soaring entrance of the Park Hyatt in Gangnam, Janie had already accessed her encrypted tablet. She didn't check the news. She checked the syndicate's internal ledger. She watched the red lines of the elders' moving assets and the blue lines of Duyun's response. She was no longer in the room, but she was still in the system. The hotel staff greeted her with the quiet, professional anonymity that only extreme wealth can buy. They didn't ask why a woman who had just given birth was checking into a presidential suite alone with 2 infants and no luggage. They simply bowed. Inside the suite, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Han River, the water dark and shimmering like a serpent's scales. Janie placed the twins in the center of the massive bed, their white swaddles standing out against the charcoal linens. She stood there for a long moment, her hands still shaking, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. She had defied the boss. She had broken the strategic exile he had tried to force upon her. Janie walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She could see the distant lights of the Osung mansion, the place she was supposed to be hiding in. Diyun would know by now. He would know she wasn't at the secondary estate. He would know she had chosen the heart of the city, the most visible place possible, to stage her stand. She wasn't waiting for him to save her. She was waiting for him to realize that the empire she saved was nothing compared to the one she was about to take from him. The transition from the sterile hospital to the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Park Hyatt felt like moving from one battlefield to another. Janie didn't turn on the lights. The suite was illuminated only by the rhythmic pulse of Gangnam's neon arteries, casting long, fractured shadows across the charcoal carpet. She moved with a mechanical grace, her body screaming for the sleep she wouldn't allow herself. She had positioned the twins in the center of the oversized king bed, a fortress of pillows surrounding their swaddled forms. They were silent, their tiny lungs rising and falling in the synchronized rhythm of the innocent. Janie stood over them, her reflection caught in the dark glass of the window, a silhouette of a woman who had been disowned by a king and was now waiting for the kingdom to come for her. The first sign wasn't a sound. It was a pinprick of light. It started as a tiny, vibrant ruby dancing across the edge of the white duvet. It was hypnotic, a microscopic star that skipped over the fabric before settling with predatory intent. Janie froze. Her heart, already taxed by the day's trauma, hammered against her ribs. She watched, breathless, as the red dot climbed slowly upward. It traced the curve of the pillow, then moved with clinical precision toward the soft, rounded cheek of the twin on the left. The realization hit her like a physical blow. A sniper. Janie didn't scream. A scream was a luxury for those who hadn't spent years at the side of a mafia don. Instead, she lunged. She didn't grab the carriers. There was no time. She swept her arms under the infants, gathering both swaddled bundles into a single, desperate embrace, and rolled off the far side of the bed. She hit the floor hard, her shoulder absorbing the impact to shield the babies. A muffled thud followed, the sound of high-velocity glass shattering, and a small, neat hole appeared in the reinforced window, exactly where the red had been resting seconds before. "Stay down," she hissed to the empty room, as if the walls themselves could protect them. She crawled toward the heavy mahogany desk, dragging the twins with her into the shadows of the suite's interior. Her mind was already racing, analyzing the angle. The Park Hyatt was one of the tallest buildings in the district. To get that shot, they had to be on the roof of the trade center across the street. This wasn't a warning. It was an assassination attempt on the non-blood heirs Bae Diyun had just cast aside. Suddenly, the heavy suite door didn't just open, it exploded inward. Janie reached for the heavy glass lamp on the floor, ready to use it as a club, but the silhouette in the doorway stopped her breath. It was tall, lean, and moved with a lethality she recognized in her marrow. Bae Diyun stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing the charcoal suit anymore. He was in a black tactical jacket, his side-parted hair slightly disheveled, his intense dark eyes scanning the room with the speed of a computer processor. Behind him, 3 men in tactical gear moved past him, their silenced weapons raised toward the shattered window. "Janie," he said. His voice wasn't the dead horizontal line from the hospital. It was tight, vibrating with a repressed violence that made the air in the room feel heavy. "You told the world they weren't yours," Janie whispered from the floor, her grip tightening on the twins. "You signaled the wolves. Well, the wolves are here, Diyun. Is this what you wanted?" Diyun didn't answer immediately. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to one knee in front of her. He didn't reach for her touch this time. He reached for the wall behind her, checking the perimeter. But for a split second, his gaze dropped to the babies. His jaw tightened, the angular line of his face becoming even sharper. "I told you to go to the secondary estate," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The estate is a fortress. This hotel is a glass cage. I am not a secret to be kept in the countryside," Janie snapped, her chin lifting even as she sat on the cold floor. "If they are going to die, they will die in the light where everyone can see what kind of man you are." A second shot hissed through the air, embedding itself in the headboard of the bed. Diyun's hand flew to the back of Janie's neck, forcing her head down as he shielded her body with his own. For the first time since the labor began, she felt the heat of him, the matte olive skin of his neck, the faint scent of cedar and gunpowder. "The board moved faster than I anticipated," Diyun muttered against her ear. "Elder Park didn't wait for the paternity results. He wants the vacuum filled tonight." "Then fix it," Janie said, her eyes meeting his. "You disowned them to protect them, and yet here we are, bleeding on a hotel carpet. Your distance didn't save us, Diyun. It just made us easier targets." Diyun looked at her, really looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, the emotionally detached mask slipped. There was a raw, jagged recognition in his eyes. He saw the woman who had saved his empire, now holding his future in the dark. "The car is in the basement," he said, standing up and pulling her to her feet in one fluid motion. "We aren't going to the secondary estate anymore. You were right, Janie. The ghosts are done hiding." He turned to his lead operative. "Black out the block. If anything moves on that roof, eliminate it." As he led her toward the service elevator, his hand stayed firmly on the small of her back. It wasn't the possessive touch of a husband, not yet. It was the tactical grip of a partner who realized he had almost lost the only person capable of standing beside him. The red was gone, but the target on their backs had never been larger. The transition from the hotel to the Osung mansion was a blur of high-speed armored transport and the muffled roar of the city being left behind. As the massive iron gates of the Bay estate groaned shut, Janie felt the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't the secondary estate Grave Dune had planned. This was the heart of the beast. The East Wing was a fortress within a fortress, all cold marble, tempered glass, and high-tech surveillance. Dune had placed her here under reduced staff, a move the Board of Elders would see as a containment of a disgraced wife. But as the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut and the sound of his receding footsteps faded, Janie didn't collapse into the silk-sheeted bed. She walked straight to the built-in vanity and pulled a slim, encrypted drive from the hollow heel of her discarded shoe. She was done being the victim in his tactical game. While the twins slept in a reinforced nursery monitored by biometric sensors, Janie sat at the desk, the blue light of her screen reflecting in her dark, focused eyes. She wasn't just checking the syndicate's public ledgers anymore. She was diving into the shadow manifests, the offshore accounts and hidden logistics routes she had quietly mapped out months ago when she first saved the Empire. She discovered a pattern of leaking assets. Small, systematic drains from the primary accounts, all flowing toward a shell company in the Cayman Islands. It wasn't Duyun's doing. It was too sloppy for his surgical precision. It was Elder Park. The very man who had demanded her exile was currently cannibalizing the Empire from within. "You want a vacuum?" Janie whispered to the empty room, her fingers flying across the keys as she redirected the digital flow. "I'll give you a void." By 3 a.m., she had successfully mirrored the access keys. She hadn't just found the money. She had moved the primary signatory status to a trust held in the names of her sons. She was no longer just a wife living on a boss's whim. She was now the silent owner of the syndicate's liquid wealth. A soft sound at the door made her close the laptop in one fluid motion. Dean stood in the threshold, his tactical jacket gone, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked tired, a rare human crack in his matte olive skin. He looked at Janie, then at the closed laptop, and finally toward the nursery. "The elders believe you are here to be forgotten, Janie," he said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "They think I have neutralized the black liability to secure the line." "And what do you think, Duyun?" Janie asked, standing up. She walked toward him, her natural curls bouncing with each step, her expression one of wounded but composed dignity. "Do you think I'm neutralized?" Duyun's gaze stayed on her, intense and controlled. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, his hand hovering inches from her cheek, a ghost of the affection he had once shown her. He let it drop. "I think the elders are looking for a weakness," he said. "And I think you are the only person in this house who isn't afraid of them." "I'm not afraid of them because I know something they don't," Janie replied, her voice steady. "I know that blood isn't the only thing that builds an empire. Sometimes, it's the person who knows how to keep it from bleeding out." She could see the internal struggle in his sharp, angular jaw. He wanted to push her away to keep her safe, but he was starting to realize that Janie Lockman wasn't a liability to be protected. She was an asset he couldn't afford to lose. "There's a board meeting in 48 hours, Duyun said. "They are going to call for a formal dissolution. They want you and the twins gone for good." Janie smiled, a small, lethal curve of her lips. "Let them call for it. I've already prepared my own agenda for that meeting." She watched as a flicker of surprise, and perhaps a touch of fear, crossed his almond-shaped eyes. For the first time, Bae Duyun wasn't the only one playing a high-stakes game. The ghost had started haunted the house, and she was moving the pieces before the king even knew the board had changed. The sun hadn't yet crested the jagged skyline of Seoul when the summons arrived. It wasn't a request, it was a forensic demand. Elder Park, the eldest and most venomous of the syndicate's board, had filed a formal motion for a DNA extraction. He claimed that because Janie was not of their blood, the lineage was biologically compromised. Janie stood in the center of the East Wing's minimalist nursery, watching the medical team set up their equipment. The air smelled of rubbing alcohol and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Duyun was there, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of stone. He hadn't spoken a word since the technicians arrived, his silence acting as a shield that felt more like a barrier. The integrity of the Bay name requires certainty, madam, Elder Park said, his voice a dry rasp as he adjusted his spectacles. He didn't look at the twins. He looked at Janie with a gaze that suggested she was a stain on the marble floor. If these children are to inherit the empire you so bravely protected, we must be sure they are indeed the master's blood. Janie didn't flinch. She watched as the technician reached for the first twin's heel to draw blood. And if the results are what you expect, Elder? What then? Then the transition will be swift, Park replied, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. Du-Yoon's gaze flickered to Janie, a silent warning in his almond-shaped eyes. He knew the trap. If the test was tampered with, which Park surely intended to do, the twins would be declared illegitimate, and Janie would be stripped of her protection and cast out into a city filled with the syndicate's enemies. But Janie wasn't looking at Du-Yoon for help. She was looking at the lead technician, a woman she had identified hours ago through her own intelligence network as a cousin to Park's mistress. Proceed, Janie said, her voice a calm, steady chime in the tense room. As the needle pricked the soft skin of her son, Janie stepped closer to Du-Yoon. She didn't touch him, but she leaned into his space, her warmth a sharp contrast to his icy composure. He thinks he's testing their blood, she whispered, her words intended only for him. But I'm testing his loyalty. The samples were sealed in high-security canisters, but as the team packed their kits, Janie's phone vibrated in her pocket. A simple notification, mirroring complete. She had used the technician's proximity to the mansion's secure Wi-Fi to upload a localized worm into the medical lab's remote server. Whatever result Park had paid for would be overwritten by the raw, undeniable data the moment the canisters were scanned. But she had added a second layer, a poison pill that would link the tampering attempt directly to Park's personal encrypted device. 48 hours for the results, Park announced, gesturing for his men to follow him out. He paused at the door, glancing at Du-Yoon. I trust the master finds this transparent? Du-Yoon straightened, his sharp jawline tightening. The truth is rarely opaque in this house, Elder. See that you remember that. Once the doors closed, the silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. Du-Yoon turned to Janie, his expression a mix of frustration and a burgeoning, dangerous respect. You're playing a game you don't fully understand, he said, his voice low. If those results are compromised, I can't protect you in the boardroom. The elders will have the legal right to seize the children. You still think this is about protection, Du-Yoon, Janie said, walking toward the window to watch Park's motorcade exit the gates. I don't need you to shield me from the trap. I need you to be ready when the trap snaps shut on the person who set it. She turned back to him, her almond eyes glossy but hard as diamonds. He wants to use my blood against me. He doesn't realize that I've spent the last 3 days mapping every drop of his. He's already lost, Du-Yoon. He just hasn't seen the ledger yet. Du-Yoon stayed silent for a long moment, the emotionally detached, mask fracturing just enough to show the man beneath. The one who was starting to realize that the wife he had publicly disowned was the only person capable of saving him from his own board. The results will be read at the gala, Du-Yoon said, his voice gaining a new, lethal edge. Be ready. I was born ready, Janie replied, her chin raised. I'm just waiting for the world to find out. The afternoon light was cutting through the East Wing's reinforced glass when Janie's personal burner phone vibrated with a jagged, unfamiliar rhythm. It wasn't an encrypted data alert, it was a video file. She pressed play, her breath hitching as the screen flickered to life. The image was grainy, showing a damp, concrete basement. In the center, strapped to a wooden chair, was Marcus, her younger brother, the only person from her life before the syndicate who still made her feel human. His face was bruised, but his chin was up, mirroring the same defiance Janie had shown in the hospital. A voice, distorted and cold, spoke from behind the camera. The ghosts are starting to make too much noise, madam. If you want your brother to breathe past midnight, you will walk out of the Osung gates alone. No security. No master. Just the liability we were promised. Janie didn't scream. She didn't drop the phone. Her fingers tightened around the device until her knuckles turned a pale, stressed brown. She looked toward the nursery, where the twins were sleeping under the watchful eyes of Diyun's elite guard, then back at the screen. The wolves weren't just circling anymore. They had snatched a piece of her heart to lure her into the open. She didn't call Diyun. She knew his tactical response would be a scorched earth siege that might get Marcus killed. Instead, she accessed the shadow manifest she had mapped the night before. She didn't just have the syndicate's money. She had the private GPS pings of the Jiangji faction's logistics trucks, the very men Elder Park used for his dirty work. She was halfway to the service exit, draped in a heavy black trench coat, when a shadow detached itself from the marble pillar. "Where are you going, Janie?" Diyun stood there, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, his dark eyes tracking the frantic energy radiating from her. He didn't have to see the phone to know. He saw the shift in her posture, the transition from a mother protecting her young to a predator who had just been poked. "They have Marcus," she said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of rage. "They want me to walk out alone." Diyun took a step forward, his angular face hardening. "It's a kill box. Park knows he can't win the boardroom, so he's trying to settle it in a basement. You step outside those gates, and you're dead before the taxi stops." "Then I'll be dead," Janie snapped, her almond eyes flashing with a gloss of unshed tears. "But I won't let him die because I was too safe in your fortress." "I didn't say I wouldn't help," Diyun said, his voice dropping into that quiet, authoritative register that usually signaled an execution. He reached into his waistband and pulled out a sleek, suppressed handgun, checking the chamber with a lethal click. "But we aren't doing this on their terms. We're doing it on ours." "You can't go," Janie said, stunned. "If the elders see you leaving the mansion to save a non-blood relative, it proves you lied at the hospital. It ruins your cover." Diyun looked at her, his expression unreadable for a heartbeat before he moved closer, his hand coming up to rest, finally, on her shoulder. The touch was heavy, solid, and for the first time, completely honest. "Let them watch," he muttered. "I've spent too much time being a boss and not enough time being a man. If they want to see a fracture in the succession, let's give them a break they'll never forget." He signaled to two of his most loyal personal operatives, men who answered only to him, not the board. "Get the SUV. No lights. No sirens. We're going to the docks." The drive was a silent, high-speed blur. Janie sat in the back, her eyes fixed on the tablet in her lap, feeding Diyun the real-time coordinates of the Jiangji hideout. She wasn't just a passenger. She was the navigator, her fingers dancing across the screen to disable the warehouse's external security cameras before they even arrived. When they hit the docks, the air was thick with the scent of salt and rotting wood. Diyun moved with a terrifying, fluid efficiency, a shadow among shadows. Janie stayed behind the reinforced door of the SUV for exactly 30 seconds before the sound of suppressed gunfire erupted. She didn't stay put. She grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight and a stun gun she'd lifted from the mansion's armory and moved toward the side entrance. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of crates and dust. She saw Diyun at the far end, a whirlwind of motion as he neutralized 3 guards with a cold, surgical brutality. But Marcus was in the center, and a 4th man, a high-ranking Jiangji lieutenant, was raising a weapon toward her brother's head. "Drop it," Janie's voice echoed through the rafters. The lieutenant turned, startled by the woman standing in the doorway, her natural curls wild, her face a mask of absolute resolve. In that split second of distraction, Diyun's suppressed round found its mark. The silence that followed was heavy. Janie ran to Marcus, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the zip ties. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I've got you, Marcus." She felt a presence behind her. Diyun stood there, his chest heaving slightly, the gun still low at his side. He looked at Marcus, the non-blood relative he had risked everything to save, and then at Janie. There was no crowd, no cameras, no elders, just the 3 of them in a cold, dark warehouse. "We have to move," Diyun said, his voice softer now. "The board will know we left the mansion within the hour." Janie stood up, helping Marcus to his feet. She looked at Diyun, the man who had publicly disowned her only to bleed for her in the dark. The distance between the hospital and this moment hadn't just collapsed. It had been incinerated. "Thank you," she said. Diyun didn't say you're welcome. He didn't smile. He simply reached out and took the tactical flashlight from her hand, his fingers lingering against hers for a moment. "Don't thank me yet, Janie," he said. "The war hasn't even reached the gala." The armored SUV ghosted back through the Osung gates under the cover of a simulated power surge that had temporarily blinded the estate's external monitors. Marcus was whisked away to a secure medical wing by Diyun's most trusted private doctor, leaving Janie and Diyun standing in the dim, cavernous garage. The air was thick with the scent of hot engine oil and the ozone of the city's rain. Diyun stood by the driver's side door, his chest still heaving slightly. In the harsh overhead fluorescent light, the emotionally detached mask was gone. There was a smear of dark blood across his high straight cheekbone, not his own, and his jet-black hair was disheveled for the first time since Janie had known him. Janie didn't go to the elevator. She walked toward him, her trench coat stained with warehouse dust, her natural curls wild and damp. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, silk handkerchief she had carried from the nursery. As she stepped into his space, Diyun stiffened, his almond-shaped eyes tracking her hand with a predator's instinct. But he didn't say, "Don't touch me." He didn't move away. Janie raised the cloth and gently wiped the blood from his cheek. Her touch was steady, a silent communication of fact. "You're bleeding," she whispered. Diyun's breath hitched. He looked down at her, the distance between them, the miles of calculated silence and public humiliation, evaporating in the small space between their heartbeats. He reached up, his fingers closing over hers, pinning the handkerchief against his skin. His hand was warm, scarred, and trembling with the ebbing adrenaline of the rescue. "The elders will know we left," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "Park will use the paternity results tomorrow night to justify the breach. He'll say I went to eliminate the evidence." "Let him say it," Janie replied, her dark eyes glossy but fierce. "By the time he opens his mouth at the gala, his accounts will be empty and his loyal technicians will be answering to me. He thinks he lured me out to kill me. He doesn't realize he just gave me the final piece of his digital signature." Diyun looked at her with a burgeoning, dangerous pride. He had spent years building a wall of isolation to protect his empire, believing that blood was a liability. But looking at the woman who had just navigated a rescue mission and a financial coup simultaneously, he saw the truth. "I spent the last week trying to save you by throwing you away," Diyun admitted, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I thought if I made you a ghost, the wolves wouldn't find you. I was wrong. You're not a ghost, Janie. You're the storm." "Then stop trying to be the umbrella," Janie said, her chin lifting. For the first time since the hospital, the tension in his face snapped. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, honest second. It wasn't a romantic reconciliation, it was a pact. A truce signed in the blood of their enemies and the shared air of a basement garage. "Tomorrow night, at the Burgundy Gala," Diyun muttered, "we end it. No more secondary estates. No more lies. I'll be there," Janie said. "And I won't be wearing a mask." He stepped back, the boss, returning as he straightened his shirt, but the warmth remained in his gaze. He gestured toward the elevator. "Go to the twins. Rest. I have to handle the fallout of the docks." Janie nodded once. As she walked away, she felt his eyes on her, not as a burden to be managed, but as a partner to be feared. The distance had collapsed. The non-blood wife was no longer outside the gates. She was the heart of the fortress, and she was ready to burn the board of elders to the ground. The atmosphere in the Osung boardroom was suffocating, thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and the cold arrogance of men who believed they owned the future. Bae Duyun sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his expression a masterpiece of emotionally detached neutrality. Across from him, Elder Park adjusted his spectacles, a thick dossier in front of him. "The DNA results from the independent lab are conclusive, Master," Park began, his voice a dry, triumphant rasp. "The lineage is compromised. The twins are not of your blood. According to the syndicate charter, your marriage is void, and the black liability must be removed from the estate by dawn. The other elders nodded in a synchronized display of predatory intent. They looked at Do-yoon, waiting for him to yield, to cast Janie out for the final time. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the room didn't shudder this time. They opened with a slow, deliberate grace. Janie Lockman stepped into the room. She wasn't wearing the hospital gown or the oversized trench coat from the docks. She wore a structured, deep emerald silk suit that complemented her warm brown skin, her natural curls voluminous and crowned with a minimalist gold band. She looked every bit the empress she had become in the shadows. "The results are indeed conclusive, Elder Park," Janie said, her voice a calm, resonant chime that silenced the room. "But perhaps you should check the digital timestamp on the file you're holding." Park scoffed. "This is a boardroom, not a nursery, madam. You have no standing here." "I have the standing of a primary signatory," Janie replied, walking toward the table with a predatory elegance. She didn't look at Do-yoon, though she could feel his intense, dark gaze tracking her every move. She placed a slim, transparent tablet on the obsidian surface and tapped the screen. A holographic ledger projected into the air, glowing with an aggressive blue light. "While you were busy bribing a lab technician to forge a paternity test," Janie continued, her almond eyes locked on Park, "I was busy tracing the $400 million you've siphoned into the Cayman Shell Company Silver Lotus. Or should I say, the money you tried to siphon." The color drained from Park's face, leaving his skin a sickly, sallow gray. "I've redirected those assets," Janie said, her voice dropping into a lethal whisper. "They are now held in an irrevocable trust for the heirs you just tried to delegitimize. And since those accounts were tied to the syndicate's primary liquidity, you've effectively bankrupted the board's private pension fund to pay for your own coup." The other elders erupted in a frantic, hushed panic, clutching their tablets and phones. One by one, their faces mirrored Park's horror. "You have no authority to move those funds," one elder shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "I do when the security keys were handed to me by the master himself." Janie lied smoothly, finally glancing at Do-yoon. Do-yoon didn't skip a beat. He leaned forward, his angular jawline set in a terrifyingly sharp line. "My wife saved this empire while you were all plotting its funeral," he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl of authority. "She has my full authorization. The board is now insolvent. And according to the charter I wrote, an insolvent board is a dissolved board." He stood up, the movement as sudden and lethal as a blade. "Elder Park, you will be escorted to the basement. The rest of you have 10 minutes to sign over your remaining voting shares to the trust Janie has established, or the police will receive the forensic evidence of your embezzlement by midnight." The boardroom coup was over in minutes. The wolves who had come for the ghost were now begging for their lives. As the elders were led out by Do-yoon's silent, tactical guards, the room fell into a heavy, charged silence. Janie stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the sprawling lights of Seoul. She felt a presence behind her, the heat of him, the scent of cedar and the weight of a week's worth of unspoken truth. "You told them I gave you the keys," Do-yoon said, stopping just inches from her. "I had to give you an out, Ding," Janie replied, turning to face him. Her expression was wounded but composed. "If they thought I did it alone, they'd never stop hunting me." Do-yoon reached out, his fingers brushing against the gold band in her hair. His eyes were no longer cold. They were burning with a fierce, singular recognition. "You didn't just save the money, Janie," he muttered. "You saved the name." "I saved my children's future," she corrected him. The name was just the collateral. He looked at her, the Korean Mafia Boss, finally surrendering to the man who loved her. "The Burgundy Gala is tomorrow," he said. "The world thinks we are fractured. Let's show them what a unified empire looks like." Janie nodded once, her hand coming up to cover his on her shoulder. The distance was gone. The non-blood wife had just bought the kingdom. The Burgundy Gala was a sea of shimmering silk and whispered treachery. Held in the grand ballroom of the Shilla, it was the one night of the year when the syndicate's elite gathered to play at being civilized. But tonight, the air was different. The fracture, in Bae Do-yoon's house was the only topic on anyone's lips. Janie stepped out of the black armored SUV, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. She was a vision in deep burgundy velvet, the fabric clinging to her curves like a second skin, her warm brown shoulders bare and glowing under the chandeliers. Her natural curls were swept up, adorned with a constellation of diamonds that caught the light with every turn of her head. Beside her, Do-yoon was a study in lethal elegance. His black tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his sharp jawline set as he offered her his arm, not as a courtesy, but as a claim. As they entered the ballroom, a vacuum of silence followed them. The syndicate wives, a collection of women who dealt in soft intelligence as ruthlessly as their husbands dealt in lead, huddled in tight circles. Janie felt their eyes, calculated, pitying, and sharp. "Look at her," one whispered loudly enough to be heard. Still holding her head up after being disowned in a hospital bed. Janie didn't flinch. She leaned into Do-yoon, her voice a low, melodious hum. "Go handle the captains, Do-yoon. I have some gardening to do among the roses." He looked at her, his almond eyes flickering with a rare, dark amusement. "Don't prick your fingers, Janie. I'm the one with the shears tonight," she replied. Janie glided toward the center of the wives' circle. She didn't wait to be invited. She accepted a glass of champagne and turned to Mrs. Choi, the wife of the man who controlled the syndicate's northern ports, and a known ally of the now disgraced Elder Park. "Mrs. Choi," Janie said, her smile as sweet as it was dangerous. "I heard your husband was looking into real estate in the Caymans recently. Such a shame the Silver Lotus holdings were liquidated this morning." Mrs. Choi's glass trembled. The women surrounding her went still. "I don't know what you're talking about," the woman hissed. "Don't you?" Janie tilted her head, her gaze glossily impenetrable. "I also heard that your son's university tuition in London was being paid out of the syndicate's private pension fund. The fund that no longer exists because of Elder Park's poor investments. It would be a tragedy if he had to come home in the middle of a semester." Janie moved through the room like a ghost in the machine. To one woman, she whispered about a secret mistress. To another, she mentioned an offshore account that had been flagged for an audit by her new trust. By the time she reached the far end of the ballroom, the network of alliances that had supported the elders was in tatters. She hadn't fired a single bullet, but she had neutralized the soft power of the board before the main course was served. She felt a presence behind her, a familiar, grounding heat. "They're terrified of you," Do-yoon muttered into her ear as he handed her a fresh glass. "3 captains just asked me if I'd reconsidered the succession fracture. They've realized the money follows you, not the elders. Information is just currency that hasn't been spent yet," Janie said, her eyes meeting his. But as she looked across the room, she saw a waiter moving toward Do-yoon with a tray of crystal flutes. There was something in the man's gait, a slight, unnatural stiffness in his shoulder, that made the hair on the back of Janie's neck stand up. She watched the waiter's hand. It hovered just a fraction of a second too long over one specific glass before offering it to Do-yoon. "Do-yoon, wait," Janie whispered, her hand closing over his wrist just as his fingers touched the stem. She didn't make a scene. She simply took the glass from the waiter's tray herself. "This one looks much crisper," she said to the man, her eyes boring into his. "Don't you agree?" The waiter's pupils dilated. He tried to pull the tray back, but Janie's grip was like iron. "Do-yoon," she said, her voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. "I think the wolves just tried to send us a final toast." Do-yoon's expression shifted instantly from a husband's warmth to a predator's focus. He didn't look at the glass. He looked at the waiter. His hand went to the small of Janie's back, pulling her behind him as his security detail materialized from the shadows of the ballroom. The burgundy gala was about to end, and the real purge was about to begin. The ballroom was a kaleidoscope of spinning lights and sudden, jagged motion. As Janie's hand tightened on the poisoned flute, Do-yoon's primary operative, a man who moved like a blade, intercepted the waiter before he could reach for the concealed weapon in his jacket. The chaos was silent, a professional's execution in a room full of amateurs. Within seconds, the waiter was dragged through the service doors, and the gala continued, the guests blissfully unaware that the king and queen had just survived their final assassination attempt. Janie didn't let go of Do-yoon's arm. She led him through the same service doors, her burgundy velvet gown sweeping the floor, her expression a mask of lethal calm. They found themselves in the cold, industrial basement of the Shilla. The captive was pinned against a concrete pillar, his face bloodied, his eyes wide with the realization that he had badly miscalculated the parameters of his assignment. Do-yoon stopped in the doorway, his silhouette long and dark against the fluorescent lights. Janie stepped forward. She didn't wait for Do-yoon to speak. She pulled the slim, encrypted tablet from her clutch and held it up to the captive's face. Elder Park's final payment was canceled 10 minutes ago, Janie said, her voice a level, terrifying communication of fact. You're working for a ghost. If you want to see the sun again, you tell us where the rest of the Jangji cells are hiding. The man looked at her, at the liability he had been told was a weak point, and saw only the sharp, brilliant mind that had dismantled his master's empire in a single week. He spoke. He gave them everything. When the room emptied, Janie and Do-yoon were left alone in the quiet, echoing basement. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving behind the raw, jagged truth of what they had become. Do-yoon reached out, his fingers closing over Janie's hand, not to guide her, but to hold her. The board is gone, he muttered, his almond eyes searching hers. The assets are secure. The wolves have been fed their own teeth. And the fracture? Janie asked, her chin slightly raised, her single tear from the hospital now a distant memory. Do-yoon pulled her into his space, his hand resting on the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the soft, tight curls at her temple. For the first time, he didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had finally found the only person in the world he could trust. There is no fracture, Janie, he said, his voice a low, honest vibration. The world saw me disown you, but tonight they saw you save me. The non-blood wife is the only reason the Bay name still exists. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Tomorrow, we announce the new succession. You won't be at the secondary estate. You'll be at the head of the table. Beside me. Janie looked at him, her almond eyes glossy but steady. She had walked through the fire of rejection, saved an empire, and outmaneuvered a century of tradition. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was his equal. I won't just be beside you, Do-yoon, she whispered, her hand moving up to grip the lapel of his tuxedo. I'll be the one making sure the wolves never even get to the door. Do-yoon smiled, a rare, genuine tilt of his lips that changed his entire face. I know you will. As they walked back toward the elevator to return to their children, the distance that had started with a cold, "Don't touch me," had completely collapsed. The empire was no longer a cage of blood and tradition. It was a unified front, built by a man who learned to lead and a woman who refused to be forgotten. The king had his queen, and the ghosts were finally the ones in control.